morning, everybody. Welcome to Soapbox Slam, where I get on my soapbox and I talk about the things that I see going on. So this morning I want to talk about I kind of want to talk about, well, so I've done all this research on profits of corporations in America, what their CEOs make, what their senior management makes, and what their hourly wage people make. And in doing all this research, there are several things that personally I discovered. And I have broken this research down into different segments. And the first segment I want to talk about is the automobile industry. But before I get into it, I want to precursor a bunch of things. Number one, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. However, there are some positions that I am taking after doing this research and understanding this information that would make me sound like a Democrat, even though I am not. What I am is a person who believes in the working class, and I believe in a bottom-up kind of government, not a top-down government. And a top-down government is one in which both Republican parties and Democratic parties are bought and paid for by corporation and create laws that enable and empower corporations, as opposed to a government built by the people, where the people influence the government and make laws that are restrictive or equitable, either restrictive towards corporation or equitable towards people. In the last 30 to 40, almost 50 to 60 years, that has gotten out of alignment. And so having said that, as of right now and as of today, part of the reason why I support a concept of taxing the fuck out of rich people and taxing the fuck out of corporations is because of the gross inequity in the amount of profits that they make and the amount of money that they are paid versus the hourly waged person. And to me, that's important. I would not feel this way if the hourly waged worker, the working class person, had a living, a beyond living wage with disposable income. I would not feel this way, and I would not feel as though corporation and CEOs and rich people should be taxed at an extreme rate. But because the deck is stacked so against working class people and lower class people, I believe that the rich and the corporation ought to pay a hell of a lot more. And it's in essence to deter and penalize corporations and the CEOs who enact lobbyists and enact laws that continue to pad their own pockets and continue to diminish prosperity among working class and lower class people. And I believe in that wholeheartedly. And like I said, if the living wage were one where it was beyond just a living wage, and that it was a living wage that created prosperity and disposable income, well, then I wouldn't believe in taxing wealthier people and CEOs. That's number one. So as of right now, I believe in taxing the fuck, and it does not make me a Democrat. And it's not what's making me a bleeding heart. What it is it's making me, I feel that corporations ought to be held extremely accountable for the state that things are in. That's number one. Make that very clear. I will say it. I hope that you guys do watch all of this. It might be a little lengthy. I will minimize any ad hominem or hyperbole. But this is well researched. And if you have the wherewithal to follow through with everything that I'm stating, investigate yourself, then I implore you to take the information and help try to minimize this disparity and inequality. Because remember, just because this is the state of things now and you might be a senior management person, and inflation might not affect you the way it's affecting other people and everything else, just bear in mind that eventually it will get to you. And expressions like your sin is no greater than my sin, or there by the grace of God, just remember that you could very well be in the exact same situation at any given moment, especially when you have both Republicans and Democrats that are in the hands and pockets of corporations. Okay, that's number one. So that's what I believe about taxing. I do believe, and I will do a post on taxation systems and what I think is more equitable, and how I think taxes ought to be applied, because I think that is an economic issue, not a social or a culture war issue that I think is imperative to prosperity and equity in this country. So taxation and taxing the corporations extremely heavy, and taxing the CEOs. I can certainly say this: any Republican agenda that wants to cut taxes for these profits and these corporations and these CEOs are absolutely ludicrous, and they have no interest. Any Republican that's supporting that has no interest in your personal prosperity, and you ought not be supporting them. Now, if you're exceptionally wealthy and everything else, of course you would want to be with the Republicans and keep status quo as is. And that tells me a lot about your personal character. So having said that, the other issue that I have, and I'm stating with this before we get into the research that I've done, and like I said, in this research, I've broken down different segments. Today I will do the automobile industry, but I've also broken it down to the grocery stores, like the national chain store, grocery store industries, as well as individual food item industries. So like Post Cereal, Oscar Mayer, Heinz, things like that. Okay, I also broke down the banks, and every kind of sector of the economy. And so I implore you to watch these, and in following segments I will pick up and do each industry that I have researched on my own time. And so let me get back to, again, the main thing that I'm putting this soapbox, and I'm on my soapbox about. Number one is, I believe 100%, especially now, in taxing the fuck out of corporations and taxing the fuck out of CEOs. I do not support any political party that suggests that the rich need tax breaks at this point. Now, having said that, if there were beyond acceptable living wages and disposable income, then I would not feel like the wealthy ought to be taxed or corporations be taxed. But that's not the state that we're in. One of my solutions to the problem is a tax system on corporations that says anytime you have this kind of disparity, and the disparity that I will show you that is consistent across every industry, whether you're talking about food, airline, grocery store chain, automobile industry, across every airline is 100% consistent in the United States, this disparity. And like I said, I would not believe in taxing the rich or taxing the corporation. And I think the solution to the problem is setting up some sort of regulation that says anytime you get a disparity like that, the automatic tax bracket in which the corporation would fall under is automatically at X, extremely high. Same with the CEO, extremely high. The moment that you have that disparity minimized and working class people have more disposable income and higher wages, then their taxes would go down. And it's kind of like an automatic kick-in. I believe in a structure or a regulation created by our representatives that automatically put that in. I also believe some sort of automatic system when it comes to inflation, that anytime you inflate the price of things, that automatically wages would automatically go up 100% in reflection to what the inflation has gone up to. So if you have a 9% inflation, then automatically all wages would go up 9%. Automatically, it would just automatically kick in, just the way the inflation would kick in. It would do one of two things, in my opinion. Number one is it would force that any corporation to really be reluctant about jacking up their prices. So that leads me into the next thing. And there would be an automatic reflection in working wages that would automatically accommodate for that, or a huge tax penalty would be imposed on the corporations and everything else. Now, that gets me to the second point. And there's a lot more detail to that, but this soapbox isn't really getting into the discussions. I don't want to get into the discussion about taxes, because I will research and do a full examination of taxation and present what I think is a better system in taxation. Should we even have taxation? What would be a better system to impose? But that's a whole nother soapbox. I'm getting back to the on topic, and I precursor all this with my positions about automatically taxing corporate, especially in this time right now. Corporations ought to be taxed the fuck out of, and the CEOs and senior managements ought to be taxed the fuck out of. And until living wages have disposable income. Now, what's this number? You might ask, well, what's this number, Sean? The truth of the matter is, in my opinion, that number is $90,000 a year. Yes, the factory worker should be making $90,000 a year, $75,000 to $90,000 a year, bare minimum to start. That would be a wage of at least $30,000 to $40,000. I mean, $30 to $40 an hour. In this current state, the way our society is set up, the inflation, the cost of things, and everything else, to me, that is what's reasonable. Now, I'm jumping ahead. I just want to tell you, if you take just $100 million and divide it by 11,000 employees, that's actually $90,000 an employee. Now, I mean, that's just 100 million, okay? Making $90,000 a year, 100 million. Okay, that's just a quick number, and I'll get back into those numbers and that discussion, but I want to make my premise or where I'm going and my solutions to the problems first, and then you can evaluate the numbers and what I'm going through with the numbers and this particular soapbox, which is examining the automobile industry. But before we get to the automobile industry, I want to make my position very clear. That way I can just talk about what's going on in the automobile industry. Having said that, the taxation and taxing the fuck out of corporations and taxing the fuck out of CEOs, and versus what the working wage is. Now, inflation. I want to point out that inflation and everything that we have gone through when it comes to the pandemic, right, and all of the supply chain arguments and everything else, in my opinion, all of that is a hoax. And the numbers and the justification for inflation and the justification for all of these price rises because of pandemic, right, to me is actually a hoax. And we have been lied to and tricked and rused. And that is very fatalistic and doom and gloom and everything else. And I don't want to dwell on that. But to me, it does not make sense to have the inflation and the inflation rate be what it is. And when you look at this, and you look at these numbers, you say to yourself, it never need to happen. And that's my biggest point about this whole soapbox and every industry, how we were cheated. We, the people who had to deal with COVID and then turn around and deal with inflation, we were cheated. And both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, know that. They co-signed for this and they've endorsed this. And it was a money grab for the corporations, and it continues to be the money grab for the corporations. And people are starting to report now, especially with the food industry and everything else, that there is no reason for, there has never been a reason for these pricings. And I'm glad that now reporters that are legitimate, because I'm just a social media content creator doing my own research and putting it out there. There's no reason for you to believe what this dumb nigga has to say, right? I'm very well aware I'm just a dumb nigger, but I am intelligent enough to question things, and I question things all the time. And I question the entire reasoning for inflation. It's completely unjustifiable. And when you look at the numbers, there's no real justification. There are some industries that did have justification for it, but in reality, there really isn't. And those particular industries, and I'm specifically talking about when you look at the numbers of the airline industry and Boeing, then you see, and not just Boeing, the manufacturers of aircrafts, but the actual airline industries, you actually see numbers reflect profit loss, right? So huge profit losses. So there's some justification for price fluctuations and price gouging that has occurred with those industries. But I would still challenge the fact that even though all of those corporations did receive bailout money and they did lose profits during the pandemic, I will note, and when I talk about the airline industries, which won't be in this one, I'm just throwing this out there, I will note they still paid their CEOs insane profits, and their workers were not paid living wages. So having said that, the second thing I talked about the taxation, I talk about inflation, and inflation never needed to happen. It was a ruse. It's a lie. It's not the entire reasoning, supply chains and all this other stuff is actually very inaccurate. And when you look at their books, you see that it never needed to happen. It never, ever needed to happen. There was no real reason for the prices that we're paying right now. And the solution to that, and I am glad that people are starting to do it, but it's taken a long time and it will continue to take a long time. People just have, our only method to fight this, because your representatives, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, are not going to fight this. They are all bought. Whether, you know, when I say they're all bought, the Democrats might be bought by the food industry, and the Republicans might be bought by the oil industry, and the airline industry might be in the pocket of the Democrats, and the you know, big box hardware industry might be in the pockets of Republicans. Okay, but either way, whether it's a two-party system, and all industries that exist when it comes to the corporations, okay, half of them are bought by the Republicans and the other half are bought by the Democrats. And that's just the facts. And that's why I don't support any party. Part of the reason why I don't support any party is if people were not blind party leaders and they all were independents, then it would require each party to actually make legislation that was advantageous to you to essentially buy your vote, right? So that is why I think it's more intelligent to be an independent voter and require the party to pander to you. Now, if you're a very rich person and everything else, of course you're going to be a blind party supporter, because you know that party is going to always do things that are advantageous to your wealth. And if you're a very poor person, of course you're going to be a blind supporter of that party, because you know they're always going to cater to your needs as far as social services. And I disagree with both. And that is why as a voter and a person who is a true believer in this country, it's in my blood. Okay, the inception of this country is in my blood. Whether I'm a dumb nigger or not, it's in my blood. And so I believe in the enlightened ideas that my forefathers on both sides of my family, my forefathers believed in. And now I can say that with wholehearted pride. Probably more than 90% of the people who are in this fucking country. So I believe in it. Now, having said that, so I've talked about the taxation. I talked about the misnomer and the lie of inflation. And when you look at the numbers, inflation never, ever, ever needed to happen. It was a money grab. It was a cosign by all of your representatives to empower very rich people and very rich corporations to grab more money. And that's egregious and foul and disgusting. And that even further supports why I have a concept right now that tax the fuck out of those people, tax the fuck out of the CEOs, and tax the fuck out of the corporations, since they don't have the dignity to give dignity to working class people, to allow them to make money and have disposable income to enjoy life. Then tax the fuck out of them. And once they figure out that they need to pay people living wages, with disposable income, then you can stop taxing the fuck out of them and stop taxing the fucks out of the rich. But until you do that, penalize the fuck out of them. Penalize the fuck out of them, because you would not have to do that if you had a structure that was set up originally, like Henry Ford said, when you pay your people enough money that they can actually buy your own material. The other thing I want to add to all of that is the concept of keeping these wages low, to me, is ludicrous, right? Anybody has a problem with that, particularly I'm talking about the Republican Party, and this isn't a cosign for the Democrats, because the Democrats got it fucked up too. If corporations actually were paying a $75,000 to $90,000 wage for every factory worker and everything else, right now, when I go through the numbers, you'll hear what they really are making. Okay. And this is why I'm making these points. And when people are like, oh, these money, you know, you have to really look at, nobody's going to be able to tell me nobody's going to be able to tell me, because I've done the research and I know what these people are making. Nobody in all of these industries, I've done the research. Look, I know I put them in, I mean, just so that you're aware, and the structure of how I did this is I spread it up in columns and everything else, right? I did the years that I evaluated, okay? I did their CEO name, CEO pay, hourly wage, and salary wage, or senior management, okay? And so that's how I broke it down. And I looked at every year and every person. I looked at what their CEO makes, what their hourly person makes, and what their senior management makes. I'm pointing all this out because when you do numbers, right, this here is hourly wage times 40 hours. That's a pay week, a 40-hour week. That's your weekly pay. The weekly pay times 52 weeks, that's their yearly pay. And then what national rent averages are, you know, and what they're paying and everything else, right? So I'm doing these numbers. I did it by sections: Chicagoland, New York City, LA, Dallas, and Atlanta. Those were the major cities I did to evaluate. Now, this is just a sample set. It's not a complete sample set, right? It's not a quantitative measurement. You know, it's a rudimentary dumb niggers way of figuring out where the numbers are and what's really there, right? But when you do this yourself, you really do find the reality of things. Okay. Now, this here, as I wrote down and everything else, just national averages, right? I look at what the national average of rent is, the average of car insurance is, the average of car payments, the average of electric bill, the average of gas bills, internet bill, water bill, garage bill, food bill, transportation bill, and the sorts. Just to get a calculation as to what are people having to pay yearly, monthly, right? And just, that's just national averages and everything else. And that's bare essentials, bare minimums, right? And just to throw a number out there so you can see what I'm talking about here is, and keep this in mind. Again, we're going to look at the automobile industry in this slam, but, and I do it for every industry. Okay. But these are the kind of numbers that we're talking about. In this day and age, an everyday person, a working class person, essentially needs to make $3,110.78 just to get by. That's not disposable income. That's not anything. That's just paying the demand for a roof over your head, food in your mouth, the ability to operate the roof over your head, the clothing on your back, and the way to get to and from work. That's just the bare minimum to exist. $3,100 a month. That's just the bare minimum to exist. Okay. That's essentially $37,000 a year just to exist. Okay. A working class person, just to exist, put a roof over the head based on national averages. That's $37,329.36 just to exist. Okay. Now, those numbers are basically coming from an hourly wage, 40-hour per week, the weekly pay times 52 weeks in a year for their gross pay. And then what is the income? What is the expense? Okay. Just like a balance sheet, just like what the CEOs have to do as far as balancing the sheet and showing their numbers and everything else. What comes in, what goes out. It's that simple, right? What goes in, what comes out. And I evaluate all this for every company. Every company, like I said, we're going to do the automobile industry. I do it for the GM. The average GM hourly worker is anywhere between $13 to $27 an hour. When you plug in those numbers, hourly wage, $13 an hour, times 40 hours a week, your weekly pay. Then you take your weekly pay, you multiply it times 52 weeks, that's your gross salary. I promise you right now, at $13 an hour, you do not have a yearly pay that'll match or be able to handle a $37,329.38 bill expense just to put a roof over your head. You don't make enough money. Even at $27 an hour. Now, mind you, also, this hourly wage, 40 hours per week, weekly pay, 52 weeks a year, that gross yearly pay does not withdraw taxes. So when people talk about these numbers and everything else, bear in mind that the majority of people, even poor people, are paying anywhere between 12 to 27% in taxes. So you can automatically multiply this number, the gross yearly pay, times 12 to 25%, and then deduct that from the yearly pay. And that's actually what they bring home, which means they're beyond stretching and putting things off and trying to make payments to survive. The threshold number is really around $20 an hour just to meet this $37,329.36 bill for expenses to survive in this country. At the threshold, just so that you can just do this. That threshold is $20 an hour. That's the threshold, $20 an hour. That's accounting for the fact that taxes will be taken out and you having that's only the money to pay for these expenses. Now, mind you, that's not me adding in a streaming service. That's not me adding in a haircut. That's not me adding in any of more clothing or shopping or anything like that. That's not adding any of the other expenses that might influence your monthly expenses. That's the bare minimum based on national average. The rent, the car insurance, the car payment, the electric bill, the gas bill, the internet bill, the water bill, the garbage bill, the food that you need to put in your mouth, your transportation bill. That's just that. That's so that you can put a roof over your head and get to and from work. Nothing, no disposable income whatsoever. That threshold is $20 an hour. The majority of all of these companies, the factory worker, the customer service worker, and everything else, come nowhere near $20 an hour. 13, 14, 17, 11. You know, the high end, you got 27, 30, 29, 37. But those are managers, foremen of warehouses. Those are foremen or managers or directors of IT and everything else. They're not the average wage of what a person is making. Period. That's just the honest to goodness truth. You know, one number that they throw out there is that $54,000 is the threshold of what the average American makes in income, and that's not quite true. And just remember, when you have huge incomes like CEOs and then you have hourly wages, that is the only reason why you get an average of the income. When you get senior managements that make more than 6 figures and hourly workers that make double digits and pay barely $30,000 a year is the truth. Barely $35,000 a year. It's barely what they make. Then you get an average that makes that look that high. And that's that is the deception when they talk about these averages, because they include people like CEOs and senior management in these numbers, which overinflate what the actual working class is making. And so that is, you know, what we're looking at here. And, you know, like I said, I applied these, keep this in mind in doing this. I wrote all this stuff down. Right now, we're just going to look at what's going on in the automobile industry. I want to point out, and why I'm starting with the automobile industry is I read an article in the USA Today that reports that Stellantis, now Stellantis is the corporate automobile industry that owns Dodge, Ram, Jeep, formerly Chrysler, okay? Stellantis will be laying off 2,500 workers by the end of the year. One report said that in total in the United States, Stellantis has 11,000 workers. They're now going to reduce their 11,000 workers in the United States to 8,550 workers. And also in the article, they're going to discontinue the discontinue the 1500 Classic model of their pickup truck. And they're only going to have the top tier. They're only going to sell the top tier models of their pickup truck. The 1500 Classic is just a basic bare minimum package, and they're no longer going to offer a basic bare minimum package. They're going to force people to buy the premium packages of the Rams. Now, Stellantis is the corporation, so they're going to lay off 2,500 people at the end of the year, reducing their entire American staff from 11,000 to 8,550. Okay. So I want to point out that Stellantis, the company that's choosing to do this, the owners of Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler, Dodge, Ram, Jeep, has received 2 American bailouts. They received a bailout in 1980, and they received a bailout in 2008. And before I go really deep into this, and that article is why I'm starting with the automobile industry, and I share this information with you, and I would encourage you to not, it's hard to hear this, don't buy American vehicles at this point until they can start making things more equitable. I have found in my research that I'm more inclined to buy a Honda or a Toyota, and it's strictly based on the distribution of wealth. And surprisingly, the CEO of Toyota and Honda and Kia do not pay themselves what American auto workers are willing to pay themselves. The American CEOs are willing to pay themselves. And even though that their threshold for their workers is rather low, so is their senior management, and so is their CEO. So that to me is more just than what you would see in the American companies. But what's making me start with the automobile industry is the article that I read about Stellantis laying off 2,500 workers. And when you look at their numbers, it's grossly disgusting what they're doing. And like I said, the solutions to these also, I want to point out one thing about economics and bailouts, right? When originally when we borrow money from the feds, the feds is not a federal institution. It's just a name that they mislead people with. It's just a centralized bank. It's just a centralized bank. They have no allegiance to the American country. They have no allegiance to anybody. Their only allegiance is to money and greed. And I have said in many other posts, number one enemy of the state being the United States of America, the country, and everything else, is the Fed and the banks. It is the concept of financing and everything else is what is causing all of these inflated prices. And I want to point this out and everything else as we talk about the automobile industries. Before I go into detail, I want to point that out. You know, so I was mentioning earlier 3 issues: the false inflation, the taxation, and then the so inflation, taxation, and then financing, the banks. How this is why we are in the situation we are in right now is all because of those 3 factors. False inflation, to me, is rooted in our elected representatives, taxation, which is rooted in our elected representatives, and then the financing industry, that being the banks. Now, whenever the government borrows money from the feds, it was originally designed that income tax would pay that money back. And that's how we paid back what we borrowed. Now, to me, if I think, and this is a solution to the problem, I think some sort of lockbox ought to occur whenever the federal government borrows money from the Fed, that money that is borrowed is required to only be spent on American soil. It should not be spent to acquire resources outside of this country for other countries or for corporation. It should not be spent to acquire resources for corporation. It should not be spent to prop up Israel or prop up Ukraine. We should not borrow money from the feds because what that does is our income taxes has to pay that back. And so we have to pay it because it's a bank. It's not the federal government's money. They can't, it's just a bank. And so I think it ought to be lockbox that any money, whenever we go to the feds, that it has to be spent on American soil. So when we borrowed money to give to Israel, $8 billion or $40 billion, our income taxes is what pays for that money that we have to pay. With interest, we have to pay it back to the Fed. Okay, I disagree with that wholeheartedly as an economic policy, period. Any money borrowed from the Fed ought to be required to be spent on American soil, period. Period. End of story. Done. End of story. I don't need to elaborate that on that anymore. What also happens when we borrow money from the feds, if we can't make it up in the income tax, the price of all the goods around us, that's where we get an inflation rate. The price of all the goods around us, because we pay taxes on all the goods around us. We pay consumer taxes, we pay sales taxes in some states, we pay all of that. Even our state budgets are propped up because of that. So when we can't afford it through our income taxes, we raise the taxes around all the other goods and services and everything else around us to try and make up the difference in the coffers. And so part of our inflation problem has to deal with the greed of corporation, but it also has to deal with the ability to tax every step of the way products and services being done and business being done. By taxing it every step of the way, we can add more money to the coffers so that we can pay what we borrowed. Okay, so not just income taxes, but all of the taxes. When like, for example, when gasoline, there's a tax on gasoline. So if you raise the price of gasoline, then you get a higher percentage of tax on that gasoline, and that gives your state and federal government more money in their coffers. So it helps the government for gas prices to be high. It doesn't just help the corporation. It helps the government, the federal and state local governments. It helps them when the gas prices go up. And any industry along the way that we tax, the phone industry, everything. When we tax it, it allows to create more money into the system. And so that we can pay these things back. That's how many states, Indiana, Wisconsin, everything else, that's how they've been able to actually develop surpluses. Texas, surpluses in income, budget surpluses. The reason why these states are able to have budget surpluses is because the price of goods and services around that are being taxed have filled up their coffers. So they have to keep so smart leadership would say, okay, we're going to take all this money and pay out whether we pay in our pensions or whatever else, we're going to shore all that up and everything else. And then once that is, they would end up creating budgets with lower money, creating budgets not to what the fault that these corporate states have gotten into is when they've raised all the taxes and paid off all their debts, now they created new budgets based on that tax revenue. And that's horrible management. They should have created budgets lower than what that revenue brought in so they can bring the taxes down, and that would create disposable income for us working class people. We would have more disposable income because we're not paying higher taxes on everything that we do. So having said that, getting back to the automobile industry and the egregiousness that's going on and the falsity, like I said, the falsity is the corruption of the banks and financing that influence this inflation problem. The false inflation problem to be a money grab for corporations that both your Republican and Democratic leadership has co-signed for. And then, so the false inflation and then the taxation. Okay. So having said all that, I want to get back to this. So Chrysler Stellantis has been bailed out twice by the United States government. So in essence, in 1980, the United States government went to the feds and they borrowed money. And because they borrowed money from the feds, our income taxes had to increase and the price of goods around us had to increase so that the government can raise enough money to pay the money back for what was borrowed. Yes, the company itself does have to pay the money back as well. They pay it back to the government with interest. But bear in mind that we're all paying this. And then who's it all going to? To the bank. Now, in a true capitalist system, unfortunately, in 1980, there were several of our different car industries. The consolidation of the car industry only occurred in 2008. Prior to 2008, you had Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Saturn, we had tons of different car industries in 1980. For whatever reason, whoever was sucking some politician's dick, Chrysler convinced the American representatives to keep Chrysler alive. And so they did. And the company should have failed. That would have been true capitalism, allowing the company to fail. That would have been true capitalism. Chrysler, Stellantis should not exist today, period. Because once Chrysler was out of the picture because they don't know how to manage their money, and they still don't know how to manage their money, they should have been left to fail, and another car company would have been able to emerge, and maybe they would have gotten it right. That's true capitalism. And anybody who does not understand that is not a Republican, nor are they a capitalist, nor do they believe in capitalism. If you cannot come to that conclusion that that car company should have failed regardless of their workers, what would have happened? Yes, it would have been tragic. The workers would have gone, and I'm not co-signing for that. It's sad. There should be huge penalties for corporations that do this, especially when you look at the numbers and the distribution of wealth. There should be huge penalties to these companies that do this because it's their own money grab. And there should be huge penalties to the representatives, Democrat and Republican, who co-signed to allow this. And no, we can't, as a corporation or as an elected representative, we can't control what a corporation wants to do and how they want to put their pay structures. No. But we can create deterrents and regulations that penalize or reward corporations that make living wages and do right by the American people. And that's the job of your elected representatives. That's their job. But they refuse to do that because they are bought and paid by the fucking corporations. And it's disgusting at this point. It's egregious at this point. But Chrysler Stellantis has received 2 bailouts. They received one in 1980 and they received one in 2008. Okay. And the thing that is most offensive to me about the bailouts, right, is it's taxpayers' dollars that we use through our income tax. When the federal government goes to the reserve and asks the reserve for X amount of money so they can give it to Chrysler, we pay the higher taxes. We pay taxes to pay for that. But Stellantis or Chrysler, since we already own part of them, it's our tax dollars that shored their company up, they didn't reduce their prices. They actually increased their prices. And we paid the taxes on the increased prices and the increased prices to give back to them and give back to the Fed and give back to the federal government. And they don't have the decency, since we're the ones propping them up, the American public, they don't have the decency to have a reasonable price on their vehicles. I mean, that to me is just it's unbelievable to me. It's like, what? The moment you take a bailout from the country, the moment you take a bailout from the federal government, you should be mandated, solution to the problem, you should be mandated that the price can no longer be X amount of dollars, period. For the price cannot go above this threshold for X amount of years. Yeah, it would be crippling because they wouldn't be able to make the money back as quickly as possible. But you know what? That's your punishment. Otherwise, you can fail. But there should be some sort of mandate that says your prices cannot go above X amount of dollars for X amount of years until the X is paid back. Period. I mean, I think that's more than reasonable. It's my tax dollars that propped your company up, and why should I have to pay a higher price when I'm the one who's paying your CEO wages? That's egregious. That's absolutely egregious. So Stellantis, is laying off 2,500 workers by the end of the year, and they're going to discontinue their pickup truck. Now, that's only going to increase the amount of money that goes into their coffers. Okay, so that's what sparked all this. Also, the other thing is, before I get this, a lot of people want to be angry at unions and the United Auto Workers, especially when they went on strike against the auto industry and everything else. And I would argue that your anger is misdirected at the auto workers. It's not because the auto workers that the prices have gone up. It's not. The reason why the prices go up have to do with the banks and the concept of financing. Okay, that is the number one reason why the prices of these vehicles have gone up, is the banks and the concept of financing. Okay, number one. And then number two, this idea that just because you raise the price of wages, that you have to pass that cost on the back end to the consumer, is a false economic agenda. You don't have to do that. Sure, you might in the first year or subsequent 2 or 3 years not make the exact same amount the year that you chose to raise your wages of your employees. But beyond 5 years, you're actually going to supersede that period in which you initially raised the wages. You're going to supersede the profits of that year in subsequent years. It's not going to be immediate, but you will supersede. And how I know you would supersede is your employees have more money, which means they're more inclined to spend their money, especially if they're receiving their money from their company, because people like to be loyal. They are going to spend their money on the product that your company makes and all the subsequent things that relate to your company. So the immediate years, in first 2-3 years, yeah, you might have a little bit of a dip in profits, but you're actually still going to be profitable in subsequent years, and you're still going to continue on the growth path that you're on if you don't raise the wages. So the idea that you have to pass the cost on the consumer end immediately and everything else is false. It's a horrible economic false agenda that Republicans and even now Democrats have co-signed for, and economists have co-signed for, to empower and enable the corporations. It does not have to work that way. And you don't have to accept that as reality. And when companies do that, the immediate solution, other than the taxation of using the government to tax, the immediate solution is the responsibility of the consumer to stop buying their products. To stop buying, stop supporting it altogether. Just like I'm saying, I'm no longer, I've been trained with the idea or concept of Buy American, but as I do more and more research about these profits, and I will show these numbers, I will run these numbers out to you, and I will present you with the resource in which I got these numbers, which is their own quarterly statements, their own yearly statements, is where I got all these numbers from. Okay. When you see these numbers, I lost my train of thought there, but when you see these numbers, you would be outraged. I think you should be outraged. And that's what I'm on my soapbox about. So let's get deeper into this. Stellantis. I'll start with Stellantis because I want to report, and again, the immediate solution is you don't buy the products, and not just rely on government to penalize through taxation and things like that. But I would also add that, if these corporations were paying their people, and that's where I lost my train of thought, if they were paying these people beyond living wages, with disposable income, that money would be poured back into their own corporation, to their own company, and the company would make the money back up in a couple years. But the morale would keep the company to exist way beyond just a couple years if they do away with the system that they are currently in right now, and the government stop propping up and enabling this behavior. And that's what we're doing, and that's why I don't support the elected representatives, because we are supporting the behavior of this through our elected representatives, and our elected representatives ought to be punishing the fuck out of and not rewarding corporations for their malfeasance. So I've said a lot. This is a lengthy one. I will, at the end of this, you can see my documentation, where I got my numbers from. I got them from the quarterly reports, the yearly reports. None of this is fabricated. This is researched. So starting with Stellantis, which is Dodge, Ram, Jeep, they have decided that they are going to lay off 2,500 people. They're going from 11,000 to 8,000 employees. And just remember, $100 million divided by 11,000 people is $90,909. So 100 million. 100 million divided by 11,000 people is $90,000 a year. That means 11,000 people would make $90,000 a year if they made $100 million. Just keep in mind these numbers, right? Starting with Stellantis, we're going to go through all this is a snapshot of the automobile industry. I looked at GM, General Motors, Chevy, Ford, Stellantis, which is Dodge, Ram, Jeep, Toyota, Honda, and Kia. Okay, those are the automobile industries that I looked at. Starting with Stellantis, because of that article, they're going to lay off 2,500 people. Stellantis in 2023 made $20,126 million in net profit. Now that's taking revenue minus expenses and having a net income. Okay, Stellantis last year, a net income made $20,126,000. Okay. Now, remember 2023, right? We're in 2024. That was last year, 2023. 2023, we were supposed to be out of the pandemic. So 20 billion. 2022, 18 billion. 2021. Now, 2021, 2020, and 2019, we're going to call that pandemic. And 2021, $15 billion net income, net profit. Expenses minus revenue, whatever's left over is for them to pocket. 15 billion. 2020, 27. Now, interesting. 2020, middle of the pandemic, 27 million. So they took a hit. Now, here's the question. When you look at 2020 being the middle of the pandemic, and the beginning of the pandemic is 2019, you'll see what that is. So my question is, did the prices have to raise? How do you go from 27 million to 15 billion? Both net profits, both net income, 27 million to 15 billion. And you explain to me why inflation was justified. Why is that justified? If you only inflated a price just to get through, then your number of 27 million would look closer in the subsequent year, would look closer to 27 million, maybe just barely a billion in 2021. But it's not. It's 15 billion. That means they inflated the price so much and people still bought because they needed to buy the vehicles. I needed to buy a vehicle. My older vehicle was just busted and I had to get to and from work. But the price was inflated so much that the price went, they sold less units and everything else from 27 in the middle of the pandemic in 2020 to 15 billion in 2021 coming out of the pandemic. Now in 2019, when the pandemic started, Stellantis made $3 billion. So the entire pandemic, 3 billion to 27 million, back to 15 billion. That's the pandemic era. There's no reason for the price to have inflated. There was never a reason for it to inflate. You can say that the auto worker strike that just happened a year ago or whatever else, but no, actually, no, that's not a good reason. And unions and employee raises do not have to add to the consumer end on the cost of things. And if you only raise the price because to reflect what it is, then your profit margins would still reflect closer to subsequent years, but they don't. They jump. 2019, $3 billion. 2018, $3.9 billion. 2017, $3.9 billion. 2016, $2 billion. And 2015, $103 million. So that's going back all the way to 2015. That's before Donald Trump took office at the end of Barack Obama's term. Okay, $103 million was their profit at the end of Barack Obama's term. Donald Trump gets in. They go from 103 to 2 billion. So they inflated their prices and they made extreme profits. Okay, and the CEO of Stellantis is a guy by the name of Carlos Torres. The CEO salary, $39.5 million. That's a salary. The CEO, $39.5 million. The hourly worker makes anywhere between $17 to $29 an hour. Now, keep in mind, $17 an hour is the factory worker. The $29 an hour that they list is more for the foreman of the factory or the director of IT. Okay, they're the more senior management, still factory, because they're not senior management. They're just the higher end of the factory operations. Okay, shift managers, that sort of thing. They're the ones, shift managers, making $29 an hour. The regular factory workers making $17 an hour. Now, before I move to the other industries, we're just going to look at Stellantis. When you just look at that number at $17 an hour, you can do your own numbers. $17 an hour times 40 hours a week is less than $760 a week. $760 a week, and that's actually $760 is the number for $19 an hour. Okay, so at $2 less, you're actually going to be about $680, maybe even $660. $660 a week times 52 weeks. Okay, that's not with taxes. That's going to be the gross pay. And after they get that gross pay a year, you still have to take out taxes each week. Okay, now the national average for rent is $1,536. Multiply that times 12 months, you're going to be at about $18,000 a year. $18,500, $18,500 a year just to put a roof over your head. Chicagoland is about $1,800. New York City's $3,000. LA's about $2,000. Dallas is about $1,400. Atlanta is about $1,600. Now, that's just the average rent and everything else. A one-bedroom apartment, that's for a one-bedroom apartment in those areas, okay? So a single person, one-bedroom apartment, Stellantis only pays $17 an hour, okay? Stellantis. But they made $20 billion last year. They made $20 billion in 2022. They made $15 billion in 2021. And in the middle of the pandemic, epidemic, pandemic, nation, worldwide shutdown, everything else, they made $27 million. And in 2019, they made, the beginning of the pandemic, $3 billion. Okay, like I said before, simply $100 million, $100 million, just $100 million out of the 20 billion, the 18 billion, 15 billion. Now, yeah, they would have, here, I do want to say this, they would have lost a lot of money if they were paying wages and they only made 27 million in the pandemic. Okay, they would have lost money. Okay, but just keep in mind, and I have an answer to that. Just keep in mind, $100 million divided by all the employees of Stellantis in the United States, continental U.S., would be 11,000. 100 million divided by 11,000 is $90,000 a year. Okay? If you divide the $90,000 a year by 52 weeks, that's going to give you a weekly wage that each person could make a week. Okay, but Stellantis refused to do that. Like I said, Stellantis pays their CEO $39.5 million. Now, let me footnote all of these CEOs and footnote a couple other things. All of these CEOs make extreme extreme wages. They're all in the 30s and 20 millions, all of them across the entire industry. And all CEOs in the United States make about that much. Now, usually their salary is about $1 to $2 million, and then they get bonuses and they get stock options for being the CEO that prop up that income. Okay, so it looks like, you know, when I say that, and it could mislead you to think that, oh, wow, that's what they pay out like that. It's not quite like that. What they're paying out is probably $2 million in salary. But the other, you know, 30 with Stellantis, he makes 39, 40, round up, $40 million a year. If he's only makes $2 million, that means $38 million is in bonuses and stock options. Okay. Also, the other footnote I want to say is that, like with Ford and GM, whenever any corporation, this is a law, a tax law, any corporation that operates at a net loss in 1 year, if they don't make a profit that year, they don't have to pay taxes for subsequent years. In fact, they receive a tax return based on the taxes that they had in previous years. So, and that exists for about 3 years, I think is the number, where they don't have to pay taxes for 3 years. And they actually receive a tax return. Just like you as an individual taxpayer get a tax return, and the corporation gets a tax return for 3 years of that money if they have a net loss. After they pay the revenue and their expense minus their expenses, if they operate at a net loss, then they get a tax return and they don't have to pay taxes for 3 subsequent years. Okay, that's the law. So if Stellantis during the pandemic, and Ford did do this, but if Stellantis did make no money, not even the 27 million that they did in the middle of the pandemic, they would have been reimbursed by the United States government. There's no reason to bail them out. Period. Period. No bailout should ever occur. No representative. It's unfortunate. A new company should emerge. Those employees should be able to transfer to the new company and start building something new. But that company deserves to fail. The CEO deserves to fail. The CEO should never be allowed to run another corporation or anything else. You failed. You ran a company into the ground. You need to be wiped off the face of the earth. Not killed, but as far as business management, you're a horrible business leader. That's what Stellantis is doing. Yet Stellantis needs to lay off employees. I'll never buy another Dodge product ever in my life. And I would encourage you to do the same. In addition to the federal government taxing the fuck out of Stellantis at $20 billion for 2023. Yeah, tax the fuck out of them. And tax the fuck out of Carlos Torres, who makes $40 million a year, when you only can pay an hourly wage of $17 an hour. And again, that's not even the minimum wage. That's not even a livable wage. Period. Stellantis. Okay, now I'll go through the other companies. Just look at the stuff, right? GM, $10 billion, 2023. 2022, $8 billion. 2021, pandemic, $9 billion. 2020, $6 billion. 2019, pandemic, $6 billion. So even through the pandemic, $6 billion, and then in coming out of the pandemic in 2021, $9 billion. And guess what? Prices were inflated. There was no need to inflate the price, but they did anyways. And in 21, they made $9 billion. In 22, they made 8.9, but rounded up, it's $9 billion. And then in 2023, they made $10 billion. So in subsequent years, they've been making $1 billion year over year since the pandemic more. Why did you ever have to raise the price? You never did. Never, ever. The pandemic inflation prices is a ruse, especially in the automobile industry. But it's the same in every other industry when you look at these numbers. And this is what I'm on my soapbox about. $10 billion last year. In the pandemic, 2019, 6, 2020, 6 billion, 2021, 9 billion. They doubled. Not even just 100 millions. They doubled their billion. They made $2 billion more, $3 billion more coming out of the pandemic. All because they raised their prices. Why? What was the point of that? Why did you have to raise prices? You didn't. and they still made the money. 2018, $7 billion. Now in 2017, they actually operated at a net loss, and they lost over $3 billion. But like I said earlier, when any corporation has a loss, they don't have to pay taxes, and they get a tax return based on the previous year's taxes. So what they paid in previous years, they actually get back for the 3 years that they don't have to pay taxes. They receive a tax return if you're a corporation. Facts. Okay. 2016, $9 billion. And 2015, $9 billion. Now, when you look at 2015 and 2016, they're at $9 billion based on volume and number of vehicles sold. What has happened in subsequent years and why they're back at $9 billion in 2021, 2022, 2023, they're not selling as many vehicles. They just chose to raise the price so high that the ones that they did sell, they can still make a huge profits off of it. But they're not selling as many units as they did back then. They made $9 billion based on how many units they sold, not based on the price of the units. Because I had a GM back in those years, and I didn't pay in the price that a GM truck costs now. There were more GMs on the road. They were selling more units, and they made $9 billion off of the amount of units that they sold, not because they rose the price of individual units and sold less units. Facts. The CEO of GM is Mary Barra. Her salary is $27.8 million. The average hourly worker at GM, a factory worker putting this stuff together, makes $13 an hour. The managers or the foreman or the shift manager makes $27 an hour. Okay? $13 to $27 an hour. $27 an hour is barely $60,000 a year. $27 an hour is barely $60,000 a year. Barely. Okay? $13 an hour. That's the average of, what the majority of factory workers are making. The customer service reps and all those, that's what they're making. $13 an hour. I can tell you right now, the threshold to survive in America with the average rent at, just the American average rent at $1,539, the threshold for the cost of living and everything else is $37,000 a year. That's $3,000 a month. That's the threshold just to put a roof over your head. And at $13 an hour, you're never going to get there. Even at $27 an hour, you're never going to get there when just the bare minimum is $37,000 a year. At $27 an hour. Look, I know people who make $20 an hour and they barely make $34,000 a year before taxes. So $7 more an hour. Yeah, you are going to make about $42,000 a year. But when you have to pay $37,000 minus $42,000, that's only a $5,000 pocket money of disposable income. $5,000 over the course of a year of disposable income. That's what we're looking at here. So when I get back to tax the fuck out of the corporation and tax the fuck out of Mary Barra until they can start paying salaries, living wages for all of their employees, living wages that has disposable income, looking at about anywhere between $75,000 to $90,000 a year, until the corporation is willing to pay that for their hourly workers at a minimum, jumping point, entry level. Until they're willing to pay that, tax the fuck out of GM and tax the fuck out of Mary Barra. Period. And I don't believe that if these hourly workers were making $90,000 livable wages, then I wouldn't believe in taxing that. If these were the numbers and the hourly workers were making $90,000 a year, I would say leave it as is. The inflation and the reason why we have these numbers is because the banks finance vehicles, which allows corporation to raise the price of vehicles. so that people are indebted to the banks for an extended period of time, and then they can get the product sold at that price. That's the reason why the banks are the culprits in this. Your elected representatives are culprit because they enabled and allowed the inflation rates to occur when these corporations inflated these prices. The government could have stepped in immediately and started taxing the fuck out of them and deterred them trying to charge them. Do you want to raise these prices? You're going to pay a reflective tax increase. Based on the rate of increase that you have raised the price, you're going to pay that same rate, whatever that number is. If you raise the price 8-9%, then your taxes are going to go up 8-9%. So there's going to be an immediate reflection on taxation. Now, I wouldn't believe that. Again, I wouldn't say those kind of things if the hourly worker was making a living wage. But at $13 an hour, they're not making a living wage, period. Ford, 2023, $4 billion. 2022, negative $2 billion. 2021, $17 billion. That's coming out of the pandemic. Middle of the pandemic, 2020, negative $1 billion. The beginning of the pandemic, also $84 million. So they lost money. But remember, anytime a corporation loses money and they're not profitable, they don't have to pay taxes for the subsequent years, and they receive a tax return based on the money based on the taxes that they paid the previous years. Okay. In 2018, $3 billion. 2017, $7 billion. 2016, $4 billion. 2015, $7 billion. Now, I will also note that these negative numbers in 2022 and 2020 also have to do with the fact that Ford has retooled their plants, their production plants. They've retooled them several times, once to adhere to the electric industry and everything else. So a lot of these negative numbers aren't because they didn't sell units and everything else. It's because they used their own money to retool their factories to meet the electric car industry competition demands or that sort of thing. And again, when you operate at a net loss, you don't have to pay taxes for 3 years. And instead, you receive a tax return in the amount based on the taxes that you paid in subsequent years. So Ford, while on paper might look like this is negative and everything else, they're still doing okay. There's no reason to ever bail out a corporation. And Ford has never, ever taken a bailout. GM has taken a bailout. In 2008, that was the only bailout that they took. They took a bailout from the federal government. Your taxes went up. Inflation went up because the federal government borrowed money from a bank, the central bank called the Fed. And in order to pay the central bank and the interest back on the Fed, our taxes had to go up and the price of goods and services had to go up in order to be able to pay that money back. In addition to GM paying that money back. So that's Ford, GM, and Dodge, Ram, Jeep. That's their numbers. The CEO of Ford is a guy named Jim Farley. He made $26.5 million. The hourly worker at Ford makes anywhere between $14 to $33 an hour. Keep in mind that the $33 an hour is the Ford plant manager, the shift manager, the IT manager or director. The majority of operating people, the customer service and the plant workers are making $14 an hour. That's facts. That's facts. Okay, so that even though you got a $33 an hour, you say, oh, Sean, that's somebody who makes some good money. That's probably 1 or 2 people in the lower management that make that kind of money, period. Okay, the reason why I support Toyota, Honda, and Kia is here are their numbers. Okay, what I like about all of their numbers is their numbers are all very, very, very consistent. They're not erratic. You don't see huge jumps in their numbers, which means that they didn't inflate their prices. They didn't do any of that kind of stuff. It's just the American companies that did that. Toyota in 2023, $18 billion. In 2022, $25 billion. In 2021, $21 billion. 2020, pandemic, $19 billion. 2019, pandemic, $16 billion. 2018, $22 billion. So The pandemic, you see a reflection that it dipped in the pandemic, and then coming out of the pandemic, it went right back to the same prices that it was before the pandemic, same profits that it was before the pandemic. In 2018, before the pandemic, $22 billion. In 2021, $21 billion. In 2021, $21 billion. So it's very reflective. The pandemic, they took the hit, but they didn't raise the prices to jump. They kept everything the same, and the prices remain the same, and their profits reflect the same. In 2022, 25. So they made more money coming out of 2022. More and more people started buying their cars. Toyota is a brilliant company to buy. Now, they don't pay their hourly workers good money. Again, in 2017, $17 billion, 16, $19 billion, 15, $19 billion. Their numbers are consistent. Even coming in and out of the pandemic, you don't see a jump. It's consistent to what it was prior. So they haven't raised their prices, and they haven't gouged any prices or anything else. Now, in comparison, their CEO is a guy by the name of Koji Sato. He pays himself $3 million. Okay. Ford, their CEO, $27 million. GM, CEO, $27 million. Stellantis, that's Dodge Ram Jeep, CEO, $39 million. Toyota, CEO, $3 million. Why should I ever buy an American product when those CEOs are paying themselves egregiously, but yet they're only paying their employees $13, $14, $17 an hour? Make that make sense. Explain to me why I should not want to tax the fuck out of the corporation and tax the fuck out of the CEO when this is how they distribute wealth. And look at what Toyota's willing to do and still be extremely profitable and consistently profitable. Foreign company, Japanese car. Make it make sense. You can't. You cannot justify this. The inflation is a ruse. The taxation, the concept of taxing these people, I believe in, because this is bullshit. And the financing of the banks that enable this to occur is bullshit, and I cannot support it. And any representatives, your representatives should be doing this fucking work, Republican or Democrat. They should be doing this work if they're in it for you, but they're not. And they should be making legislation that allows for these American car companies to look like Toyota and Honda. Not say capitalism allows for this kind of greed. No, Toyota is still capitalism. Toyota is still capitalist. Toyota is still competing in capitalism. What you see in Toyota versus Ford, GM, and Stellantis versus Toyota, Honda, and Kia is egregious wealth. And it comes from the Americans. And quite honestly, it comes from Western European Americans who have no concept, who are so greedy, and their definition of what capitalism is. It's disgusting. And it should be penalized. That should be penalized. Honda, $7 billion, 2022. $4 billion, 2021, coming out of the pandemic. $6 billion, 2020, coming out in the pandemic, middle of the pandemic. $6 billion. 2019, the beginning of the pandemic, $4 billion. So Honda made more money in the pandemic than they did coming right out of it or when it first started. In 2018, $5 billion. 2017, $9 billion. 2016, $5 billion. 2015, $2 billion. Those numbers are a lot more consistent, and they're not erratic. The CEO of Toyota is a guy by the Toshihiro Mibe, and his salary is $2 million. Now, they only pay their hourly workers anywhere between $11 an hour to $37 an hour, and that's on the low end. But they make a lot of money. $18 billion in Toyota, Honda, $7 billion, when it only takes $100 million for 11,000 employees to make $9 $90,000 a year. That's all it takes. And they have those kind of profits. That's what I'm talking about here. If you are an employee and you're making $90,000 a year, an hourly worker, and you're making $90,000 a year, guess what? Automatically, you're in a different tax bracket, which means you're contributing more money to the American tax coffer system. That means more revenue inside the tax system. That means more money contributed to America. Okay? There's no reason that I should have to tax the corporation and tax the CEO if I have 11,000 employees making $90,000 that are now paying over $20,000 to $30,000 a year in taxes based on the current tax system. There's no reason. You would eliminate a tax deficit, the GDP, or not the GDP, but our national debt would be tremendously eliminated and reduced if you're paying this and you're paying hourly workers that kind of livable wage with disposable income, and they're able to contribute to the tax rate. You can't contribute shit to the American tax revenue coffers at $11 an hour. And the amount of plant managers that are at $37 an hour, or shift leaders that are at $26 an hour, are not numerous enough as the employees who were making $90,000. A few 5 versus 30 contributing to the coffers is way more effective. I mean, it's less effective than 30 contributing to the coffers more than the 5. It does not economic sense. And your elected representative, I'm not a fucking genius. I'm just a dumb nigga who's able to read and put 2 and 2 together. Your elite minds, the representatives that are there, even the social commentators who are totally engaged in culture war, are way smarter than me. But they want to allow this bullshit to go on. And they have the power to make the difference. They have the power. They have the influence. They have the stage. I'm just a dumb nigger. But these people like Anderson Cooper and all these commentators and pundits that are on Van Jones, and all these people want to engage in culture war, and they don't want to hold corporation to task. So you and I, working class people, are going to always suffer until more and more people start evaluating the facts. I've done this for every industry in America, corporation, these breakdowns. And I will continue to do the posts on all the airline industry, the banking industry, the food industry, the national chain department store industry, box store industries. I've done all of them. A lot. I've done well over 40. I've broken them down in segments. That was the automobile industry, and I did that because Stellantis is choosing to lay off more people. They want to be mad at the auto workers and say that they can't afford it. It's the auto workers' fault. It's not the auto workers' fault. It's not the union's fault. Okay? Your anger at the unions is misguided. It's very misguided. There are problems with the union. There are problems internally with the union. Okay? That may be true. But collective bargaining brings up living wages way more. And the concept to add the cost on the back end to the consumer is because they're not entitled to make the same profits. They're not entitled to that. They're not entitled to that. But we as human beings are entitled to liberty, pursuit of happiness, dignity, a living wage. I mean, the living wage isn't in the Constitution, but the things that define liberty, dignity, those types of things are reflected in a living wage. And if our elected representatives aren't willing to do things to deter corporations from this type of egregious behavior, then they do not deserve to be representing us. That's what I'm on my soapbox about. Have a wonderful day. And be kind.